I was going to say something nice about you, but then I was like, flattery.
I have no problem with hearing flattery. I really enjoy it, actually.
You're like, flatter me, people.
I actually believe people when they say nice things about me.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me over at the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-hosts today are Mystie Winkler and Abby Wall. Mystie is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, Gospel Encouragement for Keeping Your Sanity While Living and Learning Alongside Your Kids, now available on Amazon. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. It's not too late to join the Excellent Marxmanship seminar going on now in the Sistership. Excellent Marxmanship is all about Marx with an X, and how he has made his marks, pun intended, on the world around us. To join us as we read Plutarch, the Communist Manifesto, and more, go to scholesisters.com/Marx. In today's episode, Abby, Mystie, and I dig into Josef Pieper's lesser-known work, Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. We end up spending a lot of time on the idea of flattery, which is uplifting, let me tell you. The good news is that we decide in the end that what we are already doing works for this issue too. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
This is Abby, and today I am reading, and have been reading for a little bit, The Convivial Homeschool, Gospel Encouragement for Keeping Your Sanity While Living and Learning Alongside Your Kids. And it is by our very own Mystie Winkler.
What a great choice.
I am reading it by myself, but I'm also going to be discussing it with people at my church. We get together once a week for homeschool PE at the gym. And so I passed out a couple copies. And so we're passing it around, and it's been great. And I've been reading the part on goals this week, and which is really good because, you know, new year, new you, all of those things that, you know, basically go to die in February. And it's really good to be reminded of what the true goals are. And Mystie's words are just very encouraging. So thank you for writing the book, Mystie.
Oh, well, thank you for helping make me. I might not have finished if you hadn't been keeping me on track last year.
I feel like I need an applause button.
You always want the sound effects.
I know, I really do, but I feel like it would have really worked this time. Mystie, what are you reading?
This is Mystie, and I am reading Chesterton right now. It's a reread. At least Goodreads tells me that I've read it before. I know that there are parts of this that I've read a lot of times, but it's a reread, and it's on my 5x5 challenge. It is What's Wrong with the World by Chesterton, and I think it can go either in my philosophy category or my culture category, whichever one ends up being the last minute, needs a title in it. I'm listening to it on audio. So the narrator has a British accent and does the ironic tone very well.
Good.
So that's enjoyable. So What's Wrong with the World is the book that has the, I would say, fairly more well-known section on domesticity that Chesterton wrote. He goes into a lot more things that are wrong with the world. And there were a few quotes. Chesterton is very quotable. He's best in quotes. When you start like listening or reading. And I felt the same way. I read all the Father Brown, the complete Father Brown all at once. And I felt like maybe a drip approach would be better than a fire hose approach for Chesterton.
I think so. Even though he wrote as a human fire hose.
He did. But you just can't take Chesterton in too large of a dose. It kind of gets a bit much.
Yeah.
But this is one of my favorite Chesterton quotes actually ever. It's, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried."
Yes. I love that quote. I'd forgotten about that quote.
And then, "Most modern freedom is at root fear. It is not so much that we are too bold to endure rules. It is rather that we are too timid to endure responsibilities." And he has probably about half the book is addressing the differences between men and women. There are some great quotes in long swaths of somewhat confusing prose, but he says, this was a funny one. "The woman does not work because the man tells her to work and she obeys. On the contrary, the woman works because she has told the man to work and he hasn't obeyed."
Oh, wow. There's truth in that.
Yeah, he has some odd ways of putting the differences between men and women. It makes me wonder, like, the women that he knew and the men that he knew, for that matter.
Well, you know, he married Charlotte Mason's assistant, right?
No, I didn't know.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an announcement in one of the old parents' reviews where they're like, I can't remember her name right now, but they use her maiden name and they're like, she is leaving to marry Mr. Gilbert Chesterton. He wrote a couple parents' review articles, actually.
What?
Interesting.
How come we haven't had those? I want to read those.
There might be one on the AO site. I feel like he wrote two, but that there's only one on the AO site. I don't know. Anyway, this is all kind of a vague recollection because it's been years since I made that connection. But anyway, yeah.
That's fascinating.
Uh-huh.
Mystie will actually read a parents' review article.
See, I managed to smuggle Charlotte Mason into the episode.
There you go. Good job. And here's a quote for Abby.
Okay.
"The principle is this, that in everything worth having, even in every pleasure, there is a point of pain and tedium that must be survived, so that the pleasure may revive and endure. The joy of battle comes after the first fear of death. The joy of reading Virgil comes after the bore of learning him. The glow of the sea bather comes after the icy shock of the sea bath."
I love it.
That's great.
The joy of exercise comes after you're sweating. Is that in that same ilk? Is that what you're going for?
The messy middle. All right, Brandy, how about you?
For some reason, I always have this desire to read fantasy when it's like cold outside and foggy and all of this. It just puts me in the mood. And I was kind of looking at our fantasy shelves and I just was like, I really don't want to start on something like Tolkien or Lewis again, because I will be driven to read the whole thing and I shouldn't spend my time reading those again because I've read them so many times. And my daughter was kind of looking for something to read and she brought out a book that I had completely forgotten that I owned. I don't know if you guys have ever read any William Morris. Have you ever read him?
I only know the William Morris that's like the artist or the...
He was an artist also. I think it's all the same person.
The only quote I remember him, "Have nothing in your home that you do not believe to be beautiful and useful."
Yeah,
that sounds, yeah. I think it's all the same guy. I mean, because he also has like a whole bunch of socialist tracks.
Yeah. I mean, he had beautiful wallpaper.
This is my hunch about him. He was probably attracted to socialism because he's such an idealist.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Because that comes across in in his artwork. He didn't just write fantasy. He like invented what he thought was a beautiful medieval style typesetting and printed the books himself so that they look like illuminated manuscripts, including the reintroduction of color on the page.
Wow.
I remember studying him in the history of typography, like how they did typesetting and things like that in my design class in college. So anyway.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I had a whole textbook on like kind of the invention of print and all these different things and how they made beautiful fonts and things.
So he wrote, he wrote a number of different things, but he wrote quite a bit of fantasy. And my understanding is that Tolkien and Lewis read him. I read that at some point, and now I can't remember where I read it, so I can't cite my source, but I believe that this is the case. Anyway, years and years and years ago, I bought a copy of The Wood Beyond the World, and that was what my daughter had come out with. And I thought, oh, that is perfect because it's a standalone book. I'm not going to get dragged into a series that I can't control myself reading. Anyway, so I just started it, so I can't really say much about it. Haven't read it in a really long time, so I don't really remember it from before, but it is so fun to read it because he invented his own font and he does these illuminated capital letters and all. Every page is beautiful, even a page that's not technically illustrated. It's just so fun to read, and it's just really traditional fantasy in the way that it's written. So it's beautifully written, and it's so fun. This is my little treat for myself.
Nice.
The Wood Beyond the World.
I highly recommend it if you're looking for new fantasy. He's a good guy to check out, and you just have to kind of dig through the socialism tracks. Find it.
Hi, Abby here to tell you about the Sistership. Homeschooling is important work, but it can feel overwhelming, wear us out, and take up so much of our time. Though it is hard work, it is good work. We all need real encouragement, supportive and truthful words, and discussions that engage our minds. Burnout is real. Discouragement happens in every homeschool. Our goal is to help moms combat burnout with School A. Sistership is the place for classical Christian homeschoolers to connect locally and online. We exist to help homeschool moms overcome exhaustion and confusion with refreshing, sound, and invigorating learning. We want to equip moms to connect with local and online community and help connect with big ideas that apply to homeschooling that are broad and liberal in scope. We strive to provide smart and stimulating content for the classical homeschooling mom. We won't waste anyone's time. Join today at schoolacisters.com/sistership for free.
Today's discussion is going to be centered around Josef Pieper's essay, Abuse. I called it an essay. I mean, it's published as a book, but don't you think it's an essay?
It's really more of an essay.
So short.
Because it's a short book that has 2 essays, basically.
Right. So we are just talking about what would be the first, probably 2/3 of the book. It's called Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power, which is also the title if you were to buy it. It's just that the back of it also has this other essay called Knowledge and Freedom. So we're discussing abuse of language, abuse of power. But before we get to that, because he goes into flattery, and that's kind of the angle we're taking, there's a lot of ways we could go reading this essay. There's so much in it, but we're going to take the flattery angle. I just wanted to quickly reread. I'm sure that some of our listeners haven't read Pilgrim's Progress, but I think a lot of them probably have. And it's a reread for me. But I'm going to read the section where Christian and his friend Hopeful are captured by the flatterer. So before this is, it's definitely in the second half of the book. Like they've been on the path for a while and they have encountered these shepherds. And as they're leaving, the shepherds tell them to beware of the flatterer. So they've been warned. And yet they end up in his clutches anyway. If you're not familiar with Pilgrim's Progress, it's an analogy for like the Christian life as a journey, and they're on an actual pathway that is straight and narrow, and they have to walk on it, right? So they're going along together, walking in the way, and they encounter this man who ends up being the flatterer. They don't know yet, and he's dressed in a light robe, right? So he looks like a good guy, and he asks them why they're standing there. So kind of at a place where it looks like they could take a turn either direction. So they said, they're going to the celestial city, but knew not which of these ways to take. Follow me, said the man. It is thither that I am going. So they followed him in the way that but now came into the road, which by degrees turned them so from the city that they desired to go to, that in a little time their faces were turned away from it. Yet they followed him. But by and by, before they were aware, he led them both within the compass of a net, in which they were both so entangled that they knew not what to do. And with that, the white robe fell off his back. Then they saw where they were. Wherefore, there they lay, crying some time, for they could not get themselves out. Then Christian said to his fellow, now do I see myself in error. Did not the shepherds bid us beware of the flatterers? As is the saying of the wise men, so we have found it this day, a man that flattereth his neighbor spreadeth a net for his feet. Hopeful says, they also gave us a note of directions about the way for our more sure finding thereof, but therein we also have forgotten to read and have not kept ourselves from the paths of the destroyer. And I'm going to skip a little bit just because it's very wordy. They get in trouble and an angel basically comes and gives them a spanking, like a literal spanking, as their discipline for this. Like he's whipping them. But it's interesting that the angels often, when they get in trouble and they're chastised by an angel, they often are kind of interrogated. Like a question is asked of them and they have to answer. And so the angel tells them that this is a flatterer and he had transformed himself into an angel of light in order to deceive them. And he asked them, where were you last night? And they say, we were with the shepherds. And he was like, didn't they warn you? And they said, yeah. But did you, said he, when you were at a stand, pluck out and read your note? And they answered, no. He asked them why. They said they forgot. He asked, moreover, if the shepherds did not bid them beware of the flatterer. They answered, yes. But, and this is the part I think is so key, we did not imagine, said they, that this fine-spoken man had been he. Mm-hmm. So, with that said, and before I think we can really get to what Pieper has to say about flattery and manipulation, I feel like we need to set it up a little bit and move to the more front part of the essay where he actually talks about words and what words are for, their actual purpose. Can either of you kind of summarize that for us, or do you have a quote?
Yeah, well, he says on page 15 that communication or words have two purposes. The first is that words convey reality. Mm-hmm. So the purpose of language is to communicate truth and reality. He also says in a different part of the essay that lies are not communication.
Mm-hmm. That was so interesting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a corruption of communication. It isn't communication. And then the second element of language is its interpersonal character. Words don't really exist or have importance outside of community, really, between people. The purpose is to convey meaning between people. So they don't exist in a vacuum and they don't really communicate or fulfill their purpose unless they're being understood by a person.
This section that you just explained, I've actually used this in correcting a couple of my children. Not that I'll name any names. I try not to anyway, but sometimes, and I think this is a common thing to do. I mean, this can happen sometimes inside the homeschool community, right? You have your own secret language that you talk to each other with using words, right?
Sure.
That's why we went over the abolition of man, things like ordo amoris, because they're these words we throw around inside the community that people outside the community, and sometimes people inside the community, don't actually know what they mean. And so it's a breakdown of communication at that point if people don't all know what the words mean. Mm-hmm. I find that my kids will do this sometimes where they've made up with their friends or with each other nicknames for things and ways that actually obscure reality to anybody who's not on the inside, including me. And then they talk to me and get frustrated because I have no clue what they're talking about. I felt like this gave me the language to correct that and just explain the purpose of language is to communicate reality. And if your listener doesn't understand what you're saying, unless they're not paying attention, that's kind of on you. Like, I can't help that I wasn't there when you guys made up this way of talking about things. So, but anyway, I think it's interesting the way people can use language to like, and I think sometimes it's on purpose, like in academia, and other times it's on accident, but to basically lock other people out of the conversation.
Well, that was so fascinating. In this chapter, he talks about academia and academic and how the word academic indicates that there is a special space just for the pursuit of truth. And how ironic it is then that now that word, I mean, really stands for obscured meaning.
Right.
If someone is speaking academically, it basically means normal people don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
I loved his very simple, direct chastisement. Because you are not interested in reality, you are unable to converse. You can give fine speeches, but you simply cannot join in a conversation. You are incapable of dialogue.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Well, even when he said any discourse detached from the norms of reality is at the same time mere monologue. And I just thought that is fascinating. And I think we've all experienced that though, right? Where someone's talking about something and you don't understand enough to be on the inside. They're basically giving a speech at that point. Really, they're talking to themselves because you don't understand enough for them to be actually communicating to you, even in the way that a good speech would be communicating to you.
Or sometimes it feels like social media is just everyone monologuing, like even in the comments sections of things. So where comments should be a dialogue, but it's really just everyone wanting a chance to have their monologue moment.
Interesting. I wonder if some of that too is the non-responsiveness of the original poster too. I don't know, this is kind of getting on a tangent, but I'm thinking about how even when I feel like I've made a good comment, no one responds to it. Like it ends with that.
I think it's because just as a skill, dialogue is uncomfortable and unfamiliar. I think it's really difficult. I think a lot of people never even experience it. True dialogue, like Pieper is talking about here.
Right. So Pieper does say that something makes us incapable of conversation. Do we think it's just what Abby was saying about just not being committed to the truth? Or is there more to it than that?
There might be other things going on, but the earlier part of that section in Pieper says that it's because they're not interested in reality. That was striking to me just because we've had episodes before on being interested in something. And so to think that, you know, the basis of a conversation is interest, not interest in myself and what I think or value or desire, and not interest even in the other person, but I want them to do or think or feel or how I want them to respond. But whether or not I'm interested in reality. You know, another way you could express that is almost a disinterestedness, right? And that disinterested means impartial. I don't have an agenda coming into it besides discovery.
I actually think I brought this up a little bit in the last episode where I was saying that one thing that I've been very interested in thinking through right now is this idea that selfishness is the opposite of being educated and that being self-centered. And in this context, it'd be more like self-promoting or having our own agenda. So wanting to impose the aims of the self on the situation or whatever, that all of that keeps us from the apprehension of truth. And to Pieper, he's saying keeps us from even being able to talk to one another, because once truth is lost, then communication breaks down just automatically. So he goes into this idea of flattery, and I grabbed just the definition of flattery at the etymological dictionary online because I thought Mistie's not the only one that can use a dictionary. So I grabbed that, but then I was curious how you guys think this is the same and different from how Pieper is defining flattery, because I do think what he's saying is a little different. So in this online dictionary, it says that flatter means to seek to please or gratify someone by undue praise, praise insincerely, beguiling with pleasing words. From the Old French flatter, to deceive, caress, fondle, prostrate, throw, fling to the ground. So,
well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because that's very disrespectful, right? You're asserting yourself over someone if you're flinging them. You're setting yourself up if you're flinging someone down. And that's kind of what Pieper is getting at here, where flattery is a power move, asserting yourself, setting yourself up to dominate by manipulating the other person. And it says his dignity is ignored when you use flattery. And so that's kind of in that root there. And that's interesting.
I just think of Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice as like the perfect example.
Is that like unsuccessful flattery or?
Yeah, but I mean, but is flattery ever, that's more of the flattery side. And then we're also going to be talking about manipulation. Oftentimes we can spot flattery, right? And obviously Mr. Collins is almost hyperbolic, right? On his use of flattery and things like that. But the manipulation, and I'm sure there's more subtle people, but that's just what came to my mind, is his planning it and executing and amusing himself with these terrible things, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know on page 22, Pieper says, which I found this helpful because this too, so I had a child one time who took the story of the flatterer and asked me, about flattery, and then took it very seriously for quite a while after that. And really thought that anytime anyone said anything nice to him, they were trying to flatter him. And it was hilarious to have a child just every time someone complimented him, like give them the evil eye. And I finally had to say, like, you know what? Someone's not flattering you every time they say something nice to you. My word.
Well, and there's definitely personalities that have a hard time accepting any sort of.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, they do see things. Yeah. They're suspect of any kind of compliment. So, you got to be careful with those ones.
That's true. That's true. But I found this helpful on 22, where Pieper says, actually, it kind of starts at the bottom of 21. Mm-hmm. Flattery does not mean saying what the other likes to hear, telling him something nice, something to tickle his vanity. And what is thus said is not necessarily a lie either. For example, I might meet a colleague and say to him, I have read your recent article and I am fascinated. It could well be that I have not read the article at all and am therefore anything but fascinated. This does not yet amount to flattery. So I thought it was interesting that he's actually making this division between lying, like just outright lying, and flattery. Mm-hmm. He says, or else I might indeed have read the article and I am really fascinated. And what I said was flattery nevertheless. In what lies the distinction? What makes a difference? The decisive element is this: having an ulterior motive. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's where I started taking things the direction of manipulation. Well, I mean, to bring up Charlotte Mason, sorry, it's not a joke to bring her up, but I feel like I get in trouble every time I say it. So but in one of her principles, she talks about how we motivate children and being careful how we do it. And when she starts to list things out, she doesn't say flattery, but they're basically different ways of manipulating children. So I can manipulate a child through things like praise, right? The kids that are responsive to that. So you can do it through praise and love and that kind of thing, which is more the flattery side. Or you can do it through things like fear or comparison, or there's different ways to get the outcomes that we want. And all of those actually would be manipulation, I think, but not all of them would be flattery. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting to me how it's really, I am usurping the humanity of someone else by trying to get my desired end out of them. I don't want them to make a choice other than my choice, to the point where I'm willing for them to not even get to think about their choice. Like, I just want to try to get them to do what I want them to do. So he says this underlying design makes the message of flattery. So it's not so much even whether or not what you're saying is true. It's the desire to circumvent someone's will or get something from them or somehow impose your own will on the situation.
Right. So the Mr. Collins example is flattery, not even just because it's insincere, but because it's done to gain something unstated.
Right. I have experienced this before where someone comes up to you and they're saying things and you're like, well, that's kind of true. I do have nice shoes on or whatever. But which I know you were like, that would never happen with me. But anyway,
like great flip-flops.
Right. Exactly. But like imagine that I was wearing nice shoes and you can just feel it. They're trying to get something from you. What they're saying is not a lie, but you can feel that there's something else going on. They want you to volunteer for something. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing that flattery can be either a lie or the truth. And that's not what makes it flattery.
Well, and his point about how it is demeaning to people to flatter that, like you're treating them as objects for your own purposes, even while your words are apparently building them up, you're actually putting them down. And then I was already feeling this, and then he stated it. Is there still any area of life at all free of flattery?
Yes.
Any quarter where I am spared such flattery designed to manipulate me? To make me buy something, for instance? He says advertisements may still be relatively harmless, but it is flattery.
I think that's why I'm such a terrible salesperson. It's because I feel the weight of that. I feel like everyone wants to monetize every relationship with everyone. And I feel like I almost overreact, if that makes sense. Can't even sell like my own book or whatever, right? Even if I think it's good. But I think it's that resistance. I don't want those kinds of relationships. I don't want to be in a situation where I am being manipulated or manipulating. And yet it's funny because in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, Pieper sets us up for having this culture of total work. And here I feel like he's setting us up for a culture of total manipulation. But it's to the point where it's like you were saying, we aren't practiced at dialogue. We don't have good conversations. Or maybe that was Abby that said that. But do we even know how to relate to each other without trying to manipulate each other at this point, as a general rule?
It's an interesting contrast with another book that I read a month or so ago called There's No Free Lunch by David Bonson. And it's 250 economic truths or something. He takes different quotes from famous economists and then kind of explains them or gives examples. And so it's a really short, basic economics book. But it was fascinating in there because he clarifies how introducing money in relationships does not necessarily cheapen them, but can be a way to give dignity.
I agree with that.
In an interaction.
Like paying the worker his due.
You're showing value and esteem. You know where you stand. You're not like, do I actually owe this? Now I'm in this person's debt, so I'm going to have to do something for him.
Yep.
It makes it clear where you stand. So that was a little bit, it's a different angle because you could almost go, it's easy to rag on advertising and all that, but does that mean that all marketing is flattery? I think most is, but I don't think that it has to be. The key comes down to, I think, this dignity and respect of the purchaser. Like, are you having clear, honest conversation or communication with the person, making reality clear? Or are you, buttering them up or giving them compliments that aren't necessarily true? Or I think the other example he has here is affirming weaknesses, telling people that their desires are good, telling them what they want to hear, basically, even if it's not the truth.
Oh, that is so modern day marketing.
Exactly. But that's not all marketing doesn't have to be that, but
Right,
that is the default. And even more than marketing, I think that's movies. Here's your weakness. We'll make it look like a strength. We'll make it look beautiful so that you can feel better about yourself.
Right. You know, when I was in college, I had to take a couple marketing. I was not a marketing major, but my major required a couple marketing classes. And I was at a Christian university. I remember the professor spending some time warning us against things like manipulating through fear and that kind of thing. But he did talk about how like so much marketing at the time was fear-based. You're trying to evoke, I mean, not like a overwhelming sense of foreboding, unless you're like that Michelin tire company or whatever. You've got like this sense of something lacking, something dangerous, something whatever. So then the product can fix that for you. The product is going to save you from this sense that you are less than in some way, or life is less than in some way, or you're literally in danger, whatever it is. So that was like 20, 25 years ago. And to think about how marketing has changed to where now it's not fear is manipulation. It is almost 100% flattery is manipulation. You're supposed to send the message that is affirming, which I think is what you're getting at with this affirming weaknesses. But you're supposed to affirm whatever it is. This is supposed to make you feel better about wherever you are, regardless of whatever that means. I think it's an interesting transition in marketing that's happened over, 2, almost 3 decades.
Yep, that's a thing.
Not that we want to spend tons of time on marketing, though. I wrote down pages 30 to 31 here because he got into public discourse. And I know that, for example, in the Sistership, that's something that we're always trying to work at and get better at is this idea of, it's a form of public discourse, don't you think, Abby?
Yes. We are sharing ideas and thoughts, and there's camaraderie, but some pushback. I think it's very positive.
Yeah.
And asking questions, right? I mean, sometimes the start of a great dialogue is actually asking a question, not assuming you know the answer, but being willing and open to listen. Dialogue takes multiple voices and back and forth. So,
right. When we think about why certain parts of it are set up the way they are, at the bottom of page 30, Pieper says, public discourse, the moment it becomes basically neutralized with regard to a strict standard of truth, stands by its nature ready to serve as an instrument in the hands of any ruler to pursue all kinds of power schemes. It's kind of like I know we call you the queen of sistership. It's not that I think you're going to become the supreme ruler of the
good. It's not my desires at all.
But I was thinking about how, though, when truth is not the queen, then there's a power vacuum.
Yes.
I've seen that happen even in mom groups where someone comes in and wants to usurp the truth as the authority and be the authority. I mean, they wouldn't say that that's what they were doing, but I've seen it happen enough times that I'm like, that's kind of what's going on, where someone just wants to be, and they may even have like really good grasp of the truth themselves, but they want to be the authority. They don't want the truth to be the authority. They want to be the authority in the situation, if that makes sense.
Or the arbiter. Like they probably think they know the truth, and so therefore you're not allowed to deviate from what they know.
Well, and see, that's an interesting thing, because I remember reading about Charlotte Mason and being frustrated at times because it basically said that she knew that her influence was so great that she wouldn't always speak up. And I always get frustrated by people who will not speak up. But it was interesting what was said about her in her biography, where it was just this idea that she felt like she had such influence that if she spoke up or spoke up too soon, she was actually it was actually her respect for the other person's humanity. She was circumventing their thought process and cutting it off short instead of requiring them to come to their own conclusions. And of course, she hoped that they came to what she believed to be the right conclusion. But the point was that they needed to come to the right conclusion, not her conclusion. And they needed to do the mental work for themselves.
Yes, doing the mental work for yourself and allowing your children to do the mental work for themselves as well is definitely a pain point. It's a struggle. So I can see.
Because it takes them longer than like a 30-minute conversation.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, like sometimes even a short gap, a short delay between when you ask a question and when they answer it it can feel like an eternity depending on how personally invested you are in the question you just asked.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might not have even been that long of a delay, but the discipline to be quiet during that time, it was really hard for me at first to learn to wait and have children think. I wanted it to already be there. And I was impatient with the process that sometimes, some kids process longer than others too. So I was impatient with that.
Right. And that's kind of what he's getting at here with the flattery, and the sophistry is another theme of the essay, where it's a tool of power.
Mm-hmm.
When we're using our words to set ourselves up as the source of knowledge and truth, so that any deviation from what we say is wrong, and we are the ones who say, then we are using language as power rather than as communication. Because we are stepping in there and like trying to shortcut other people's experience of reality and discovery of truth. And so we might in our own heads even think that it's because we love truth so much that we can't let anyone else be 2 minutes in error.
Right.
It's like, I know the right answer. Let me just tell you. That isn't the way that we really bring others into truth. Just by telling them and then being the authority in that sense, the source of what is correct.
Yeah. I feel like I learned a long time ago in my Charlotte Mason boot camp and the other classes that I teach. I was the teacher of the class, right? And if I jump into the conversation too soon, it's like, well, now there's the answer. We're done talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to where I just wouldn't. Maybe for a week, I would leave it alone as long as the conversation was still continuing, because I didn't want to have that effect. I wanted them to keep working at it and thinking about it and coming back to it. And I didn't want to stop it.
It would actually shortchange their learning.
Right. But then I wonder, do I do that with my children and not see it?
Like jump in too soon?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard, especially because as moms and homeschooling, we have a range of children.
Mm-hmm.
You are more of that source of truth when they're younger.
Yes.
And you need catechism, you need the answers. You are their world and you're leading and guiding them into the world. And that changes. And so it's a hard transition as a mom to figure that out then when they become teenagers. And then it's a difficult situation when there's teenagers and toddlers all around the same table.
That's a good point.
Yeah, when you go through catechism questions and it takes 45 minutes to explain an answer to a surly 13-year-old who, thought they knew better. We had a lot of groaning and complaining during those years. Like, why can't we just move on?
Sometimes you talk about catechism and I so wish I could come and be a fly on the wall in your house.
You would probably enjoy it. Unfortunately.
Yours seems way more exciting than mine.
My pastor has a habit of answering a question with a question and not being direct with the answer that you wanted to know. He really wants you to think about it. And when we hear people's questions, I think sometimes we jump to conclusions about what they're talking about that might not be the actual thing at issue, because communication is messy. And we might think we understand the gist of where this is going, and it really isn't. And we end up having an argument or whatever because we didn't take the time to really figure out whether or not we're talking about the same thing.
That's a good point.
And the same thing happened in the class that I took with Dr. Schlecht on the history of classical education. He would pose questions and he would facilitate discussion on our Zoom class meetings, which were basically just asking questions. And sometimes if people made dogmatic statements, asking them where they got that from the text. And sometimes it was frustrating because it's like, but I just want an answer to this question.
Mm-hmm.
And he never gave an answer. But it made me pay more attention to the actual reading and seeing what was actually being said and seeing that, my question maybe wasn't the most important question if it's not what's being addressed here.
Right.
There are different angles to take. And sometimes if we get a direct answer to our question, it really can shortchange the process.
Yeah, having time to mull over ideas. I've been doing more reflecting on my 5x5 and pulling out quotes that I've underlined but haven't commonplaced. And, sometimes I'll put a question mark in the margins, to come back to things. And, spending that time in contemplation is, well, it's not dialogue, but it is a form of revisiting the conversation that the author is trying to have. After you've read the whole book and you go back, you have new thoughts and ideas because ideas build on themselves and they explain it more fully and you get a better understanding. And yeah, dialogue just takes a long time and understanding and then going back and really thinking about it rather than just taking it in and accepting it. Making those applications, seeing where they line up and conform to reality.
I was going to say something nice about you, but then I was like, flattery.
I have no problem with hearing flattery. I really enjoy it, actually.
Like, flatter me, people.
I actually believe people when they say nice things about me. It's probably an over.
Oh, man.
So how about this quote from page 34?
Okay.
For the general public is being reduced to a state where people not only are unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable even to search for the truth because they are satisfied with deception and trickery that have determined their convictions, satisfied with a fictitious reality created by design through the abuse of language.
I had that underlined too.
This, says Plato, is the worst thing that the sophists are capable of wreaking upon mankind by their corruption of the word.
So I was reading this book. It's called Adrenaline Dominance. It's about hormones. And there's this one chapter, and it's written by an MD, and he is addressing like why his view is not popular, which I would say the book's about 10 years old. His view is actually way more popular now than it was when he first wrote it. But he goes into his own persecution as a medical doctor in Southern California about how he lost his license when the medical board went after him with false claims and blah, blah, blah. And one of the things he said about his fellow doctors was very interesting to me. And I think applies in a much larger situation than just medicine. He talked about, I wish I had it in front of me so I could say it the way that he said it, which would be better than the way I'm going to say it. He basically said that these doctors would refer patients to him and they would come to him and he would make them better. He would take them off of all their medications because they could handle being taken off of all of their prescription medications. And he said that he had to come to the conclusion that this faux science that happens in medicine had actually trained the doctors not to believe their own eyes. That science had somehow become redefined as something that was not observational in nature. He goes on and on about it. And it was a very interesting chapter because you don't actually feel like he's whining and complaining about losing his license, that he actually willingly relinquished it so that he would no longer be persecuted by the state and could just like do what he wanted to do. But it was just a really interesting thing, this idea of being deceived. And he does connect it to the idea that as a doctor, if you start taking people off of their medications and you actually make them healthy, you've threatened your own livelihood because you've built, unless you're a brand new doctor, you've actually built your whole practice around the idea of people needing repeat visits. And some of that's just because insurance requires it for renewing prescriptions. So you're invested in people being sick. And he attributes that as a partial cause to this kind of blindness, where they are satisfied with deception and trickery that have determined their convictions about things. So walking into the conversation with him, they've already determined that if he's treating patients the way they think he's treating them, then he's wrong, even though all of his results would say the opposite. It's just so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to actually ask you for the title of that book later, Brandy, but
Well, say it again now.
It's called Adrenaline Dominance. I believe the author's name is Dr. Michael Platt, Platt. I might be wrong on his first name.
Okay. Back to the quote Mystie read about being unable to find out the truth, but also become unable to even search for the truth because they are satisfied with deception. Okay. Is the satisfaction with deception and trickery, is that the kind of, well, I don't actually want to do any of the work? Have you noticed that? Like almost a blind trust, and or is it laziness?
I think that happens sometimes. My mom's a counselor, and I know that she says sometimes when marriages are really bad, it's because both parties get something out of that situation. So they're choosing the bad marriage because there's a part of that serves them, which might be like a lack of accountability or whatever. I mean, you could like get into all sorts of things, like financially it serves them, whatever it is. But she finds that some couples are capable of fixing the situation and choose not to because it actually serves them to have a bad situation. And so I think she would say, like, at that point, they become unable to search for the truth because they are not interested in it. I mean, to go back to what that quote that Mystie read earlier, they're not interested in the truth because then they'd have to change things. And it might not be laziness. It might actually be because it would change their finances or what they consider to be their freedom, their autonomy, whatever. But she sees that a lot.
That's a good example.
I think it definitely can be laziness.
Oh, for sure.
But part of his point here about flattery is that the people being flattered are getting something out of it. Kind of the scary thing that he describes is how difficult it is to tell who the flatterers and truth tellers are. I mean, it would take a lot of work to discover the truth. But then the deception and trickery that we readily accept serves us in some way.
That right there is why I included this section from Pilgrim's Progress all the way to the end of the section. So he says, didn't the shepherds warn you about this guy? And they say, yes, but we did not imagine that this fine spoken man was he. That has always been kind of a haunting phrase to me, that the power of the flatterer actually lies in us thinking, well, not this guy. This guy would never do that. The final question that I wanted to ask you guys was this idea of, how do we protect ourselves from flattery manipulation? How do we protect our children and teach them to protect themselves from flattery manipulation? But I think the core of that is how do we do it in a healthy way? Because we don't want to just become cynical about every person and every, like we could become this living incarnation of the debunkers that we talked about in a previous episode, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to be that. How do we be discerning and somewhat resilient against the powers of flattery and manipulation without becoming these cynical, jaded? And I always feel like with cynicism, there is this underlying thread of anger that we don't want as Christians. So how do we balance those things?
Well, when Pieper is going over Plato's stance, he has like 3 points. The third statement is the natural habitat of truth is found in interpersonal communication. Truth lives in dialogue and discussion and in conversation. It therefore resides in language, in the word. How I took this is having lots and lots and lots of conversations with my kids and not necessarily always debunking, because I think that's right. That can turn into, cynical attitudes and, a mistrust of lots of things, but just asking them about, asking about their day and bringing up political things and having lots of discussions around the dinner table, at meals, I think lots of conversations.
And lots of sources too.
Sure.
The broad reading and the reading always grounded in scripture first.
Absolutely.
One of the things I thought about was how growing up homeschooled in the 80s and 90s, most homeschoolers were part of some kind of fringe group, most of which aren't around anymore, because they were founded on a guy and
as arbiter of truth, coincidentally,
and fell to pieces. And a lot of what a lot of those groups were fear-based and
abused power and language.
Right. Because you cut off other sources and you come here. We are the only place where you can get information you can trust. And I think anytime a person or group presents themselves as the only safe place for information or truth, that's when you run. And my parents were never a part of any of the fringe groups. And sometimes we would get the catalogs or the whatever, but they would pretty much just roll their eyes and like, we're just doing our own thing. And, you know, they would make fun. You knew when it was something to stay away from if the person wouldn't let you make fun of that movement. If it was off limits for a little teasing, then my parents taught me, then the warning bells go off. Always be teasable.
Amen.
You're just a person and you should not be afraid to read all the books. You know, you're not going to be tainted or whatever from listening to the different perspectives. God is God. There is truth. We might not have all the truth that we want or need right now, but it's there. And if we're hunting for it and paying attention for it, God's got us. So we don't have to be frightened and fearful and holding on to anyone other than Christ and Scripture.
Well said.
You know, that actually reminds me again of Pilgrim's Progress, because before they tell him that, you know, they didn't know that this was the guy or whatever, he actually says, when you were at a stand, did you pluck out and read your note? We're never really told what the note is, but you get the sense that it's probably scripture. You know, did you pluck out and read your note? And they said no. You know, so it's like they were vulnerable to him because instead of looking to their note, the saints, which were the shepherds, gave them directions. But then they also were given this note that they were supposed to refer to when they were alone. They were vulnerable, not because they didn't listen to the saints, but because they didn't listen to the note, which would have told them the way to go. And they wouldn't have needed the flatterer to try to say, oh, you don't know the way? I'll show you the way. So they were looking to a man.
And they would have noticed that the flatterer was taking them the wrong direction.
Right.
You know, you hold that up to a standard.
Yeah. I'm like, there was something I wanted to say, but it might make Abby uncomfortable.
No, go for it.
Can always be an outtake.
That's true. I mean, I was just thinking about, you know, to take it back to what she was saying before, though, about how this habitat of truth is communication. And so we need to stay in communication and basically not be, you know, in an echo chamber. But I was thinking about how over the past almost 2 years now, I've had people contact me devastated by the amount of lies that someone in their life has taken in during this time period. And what's interesting to me is that regardless of what the lie is, because it's easy to be like, well, the lie is just about the politics of the thing, but actually it's not. There's all sorts of weird theological, all sorts of things that people have gotten into. 100% of the time, those people went headlong into this idea that to be safe is to self-isolate, to be in the shutdown wholeheartedly. And so didn't see friends and family for a year, didn't go to church for a year. And sometimes these are people that maybe don't even have their own families. They've been living literally isolated with no one else. That type of isolation where they were not in conversation, true dialogue, in person, face to face, having a good conversation was not accessible to them for such a long time that they dove headlong into lies. I just think, you know, we don't realize how dangerous which is, you know, that's our episode from last year, right? About not canceling Christmas. The point was actually about how some things are more dangerous, like being isolated. Did I make you uncomfortable, Abby?
No, I was just trying to find a quote.
Okay.
And I think it's towards the end, but I'm trying to figure out where to start. Well, I don't know. So it doesn't have a good starting. He has a nice long sentence. So it's
just read the whole thing. It's okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's talking about higher learning here and the different places, but it's just the very last thoughts he had. Their task then is not to live out of a paradigmatic model of conditions that sustain and nourish the structure of the political commonwealth at large, namely the free interpersonal communication anchored in the truth of reality, the reality of the world around us, and the reality of ourselves, and the reality of God as well. I highlighted this because he says, like, clearly none of these challenges can be easily translated into an organized approach of practical action. So, when we are tempted to, be isolated, or when we go down rabbit trails that are unhealthy and untruthful, we have to stay grounded in reality. Go out in nature, go read the Bible, go to church.
Eat dinner with your family.
Stop thinking about yourself, right? Go do something good for someone else. These are the things that will keep us from flattery. When you're actually doing good things, good works that God has prepared us to do, maybe we don't need quite so much applause, or we won't be quite so tempted to get false flattery, because we'll actually be doing the things we're supposed to be doing and being about our business and the Lord's business, and that not get distracted by the flatterers and the manipulation.
Well, and I was reminded too, while I was reading this, of our episode on the liberal arts with Dr. Schlecht. And his point that he made, where the liberal arts, the freedom that the liberal arts bring is freedom from needing a teacher. So when we grow and are trained in the liberal arts, we are growing in our ability to perceive truth and reality and not rely on one guy or one source or some guru or expert or even teacher. We can listen to teachers, but we aren't dependent on them for receiving truth. And so that's one reason why the liberal arts are so important for cultivating freedom of thought and conscience, and conforming it to reality and truth, rather than having a person shape it.
How did they say in Pilgrim's Progress, how did he put it, Brandy? They didn't think.
We did not imagine that this fine-spoken man had been he.
Fine-spoken man, yes.
It sounded really good.
Yes. When we are focusing or making part of our homeschools, when we come face to face with truth, beauty, and goodness, and when we kind of know, so that we're not tricked by fine speech, when we're grounded in truth and we see beauty and goodness, we will see the difference.
At the bottom of 31, it kind of dovetails. The most perfect propaganda achieves just this, that the menace is not apparent, but well concealed. Still, it must remain visible. It must remain recognizable. At the same time, those for whom the menace is intended must nevertheless be led and eased into believing. And that is the true art. That by acquiescing to the intimidation, they really do the reasonable thing, perhaps even what they would have wanted to do anyway. They're deceived to the point of mistaking that other person's will for their own will. They bought the whole lie at that point. I love that the protections against these things are just basic things. They're not these difficult, complex things to pull off where you have to have a program and spend a ton of, I don't want to say like it doesn't take time, but I mean, spend a ton of time building some sort of new habit. You guys are saying basically like the same good habits that help us in all these other areas help us here as well. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah. That should be reassuring. It's all one piece.
It is.
Everything's connected.
Which it is. Well, then, on that note, I will just thank you guys for coming and having such a great discussion with me, helping me to see truth so I'm not isolated by myself in my echo chamber.
Every time you bring one up, Brandy, I promise to poke holes in it.
Thanks for that.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're following us on your favorite podcast player so you don't miss any of this season. We have plenty special planned just for you. All the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolesisters.com/SS101 to check it out. Don't forget to come join our reading and discussion about Karl Marx and the world around us in the Sistership. We're even having a live event today, if you listen the day this episode comes out. Sign up over at scolasisters.com/Marx. Once you're inside, go to seminars and look for the Excellent Marxmanship seminar. That's where the party's going on. In our next episode, we've got a special guest for you. We'll be discussing all things music with the best man for the job, Greg Wilbur from New College Franklin. We wanted to know more about the place of musical training in the classical scheme, and he was definitely the right guy to talk to. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Or we will miss all our outtakes.
That's true. Can you ask your kids to come back so you can yell at them again?
No. Let me read that again.
Stop me if I've already told you this story, because I actually don't want our podcast episodes to consist of me telling the same story over and over again.